This is question 25 from section 1 of the 2004 BMAT, and in this question we are asked to find an underlying assumption of the argument. So let's just remind ourselves an assumption is something that's not said but is needed to draw the writer's conclusion. So let's look at the argument. First they say gardeners are encouraged to use alternatives to peat because harvesting it damages the habitats of wading birds. So this is just a fact about A, what's suggested, and B, the damage to the habitats. Sentence 2 says gardening is now the UK's most popular hobby, with thousands shopping at garden centres, and that includes compost made from peat. So more facts. And lastly they say, so the habitats of wading birds will inevitably decline if gardening remains this popular. So this is their opinion on what's going to happen, and also it's marked as a conclusion, and it's the only opinion, so it's the only thing that could be a conclusion anyway. So if we just try to summarise their reasoning, we're basically looking at what's the connection between gardening and the habitats of wading birds. Well, two things. So it's harvesting peat that damages the habitats, and also gardening encourages people to buy things that use peat. And we're looking for a place to put an assumption, but there isn't really any space in here to put an assumption because there's no real connection between these two things. But then there's a space to put an assumption before they draw their conclusion, which is if gardening stays popular, the habitats will be harmed. So it's worth pointing out this is a conditional conclusion. So they're only saying the habitats will be harmed on the condition that gardening stays popular. It could also be that gardening becomes less popular and then the habitats might not be harmed. And it's worth saying that they are saying this is something that will inevitably happen. So it's not a possibility, it definitely will happen. And why might they think this? Well, I suppose they're thinking, okay, if gardening stays popular, people will continue buying these peat products, peat will continue to be harvested, and that will harm the habitats even more. So you might think, well, okay, an obvious assumption is that gardening will stay popular. But is that actually an assumption in the context of a critical thinking question? No, because it's an explicit condition for this to happen, and because the writers made it explicit, it's not an underlying assumption, which is what we're asked for. So we're looking for something that hasn't been said at all. Can you see anything else that might be a plausible assumption? Well, the writer already mentioned there are alternatives to peat, and if people use those instead, then in their gardening, then even if gardening is popular, then there's nothing that will harm habitats. So they're probably making some assumption about those alternatives not being used. But let's look at the options and see if any of them would correspond to that. We'll go through one after the other. So A says gardening will stay the most popular hobby. Well, that's actually just a stronger version of what I said wasn't an underlying assumption, which is that gardening will stay popular. So that's something that, again, the writers, well, it's a stronger version of something the writers made explicit, so that's not what we're looking for. B says gardeners won't use alternatives to peat. Well, that relates to this idea that there are alternatives, and if people use them, then maybe habitats wouldn't be harmed. So that's basically doing the not test. We're saying suppose gardeners would use alternatives to peat, then actually there wouldn't necessarily be much peat being used, so maybe bird habitats would be okay. So if we assume the opposite of this, it breaks the argument. So that means by the not test, this is a necessary assumption. So it seems to be the answer, but let's just rule out the others. C says that environmentalists are ignoring the decline in wading bird habitats. So is there anything in the passage about environmentalists? No. And whether or not the habitats will be harmed is different from whether or not people are paying attention to it. So this is just irrelevant. D, it says garden centres can't provide a cheap alternative to peat. So this might seem relevant because, well, suppose they could, then that would be something that would prevent the habitats being harmed. So maybe the writer's assuming that they can't. But okay, let's do the not test more explicitly. So suppose they can provide a cheap alternative to peat. Does that mean the writer's conclusion won't follow? No, because it might be that even though garden centres can do it, they won't. Or it might be they can do it, but people won't use them. So perhaps they're just not as good as compost that uses peat. So either way, it could still be that the conclusion follows, So D isn't a necessary assumption. And then E says that, sorry, just to go back to D a second, the fact this mentions cheap alternatives, and cost hasn't been mentioned before, is kind of a sign this might be incorrect, because normally correct answers don't include irrelevant details. And then lastly, E says that wading bird habitats are more threatened than other habitats. So, is anything in the passage comparing different habitats? No, it's just asking what will happen to wading bird habitats. What happens to other habitats is irrelevant. So again, we see the answer has to be B.